The Inter-Islander ferry Aratere has run aground in Picton Harbour. It comes after a week of failures that raise questions about the country's ageing infrastructure. The Defence Force 757 broke down in Papua New Guinea while taking the Prime Minister to Japan.
We're here in Port Moresby, the capital of Papua New Guinea, and what was supposed to be a really quick fuel pit stop. Instead, we've been stuck here for hours with both the business and media delegation while the Defence Force plane has issues.
A power pylon in North Auckland fell over, cutting power to thousands of people.
I was doing a bit of water blasting and all of a sudden, game over.
And now, the Inter-Islander.
In the dead of night, the Aratere's lights illuminating the Picton Harbour. The drama keeping locals awake into the wee hours.
No, this doesn't happen every day, does it? No. State Highway 1. It's definitely closed.
It's pathetic. This country is on its knees. It's embarrassing. As we said last week, the upside is it might just be so embarrassing we actually now get around to doing something about it.
Geez, do you need reminding that our infrastructure is a bit broken?
Kia ora, I'm Tom Kitchen, and today on The Detail, 3 major infrastructure failures across the country. A broken plane stranding a delegation, a downed pylon that wiped out power in Northland, and a ferry run aground. What is the cost of not properly maintaining our infrastructure? Let's start with what happened with the Defence Force plane and what it could cost us. Laura Walters is Newsroom's political editor.
So I have travelled on Air Force 757s on a couple of occasions. My first experience of this plane was back in, it must have been 2018, 2019 with Jacinda Ardern travelling to APEC and the East Asia Summit. Surprisingly, all went very smoothly on that trip. Then I also attempted to fly with Christopher Luxon to Melbourne in March. We never left the departure lounge at the Rongotai Air Base in Wellington.
The lights were on, but not much else. While Christopher Luxon used to run an airline, this morning his ride was firmly grounded.
So that was a very frustrating, very long, somewhat boring experience. We just proceeded to wait, and then we were told that there was a fault. When we were told that there was a fault, we also found out that the Prime Minister had already been told. He was rerouted very quickly to the commercial airport, hopped on an Air New Zealand flight, and off he went to Melbourne via Auckland. This was his first big test of international diplomacy, really important for him. You know, he got across the ditch, had that time with his Australian counterpart, Anthony Albanese, but then he also had the opportunity to meet, a lot of leaders around the Southeast Asia area, obviously a very important geographical and strategic region. I was talking to the Prime Minister recently, and he didn't want anyone to know about it. He is there to do his diplomatic work. He wasn't going to bring it up with any of those leaders, and none of them brought it up with him either. But of course, someone who was watching New Zealand a little bit more closely was Anthony Albanese, and apparently turned to Luxon and just had a bit of a joke and said, "Hey mate, do you want to borrow a canoe for your trip home? I heard you're having some issues with your planes again." And so, New Zealand is a close partner, a close friend. They're able to joke about it. But, it's going to be more than just Australia noticing this soon if it continues. So that was not a good start for Christopher Luxon in terms of his, foreign affairs work. And then I did successfully travel with him overseas earlier this year as well when we went to Southeast Asia. He went on a tour of Singapore and Thailand and the Philippines. And we again went on the Air Force 757. In this instance, we were travelling with a full business delegation. This was one of those situations where old Betty did her job. She played the game and we managed to get where we needed to go without any hiccups. But of course, things have not gone so well with the PM in Japan this time.
No, it hasn't gone that well.
For the second time this year, Prime Minister Christopher Luxon has been let down by a Defence Force airplane. The Boeing 757 blew a fuse in Papua New Guinea, leaving it unable to fly high enough to take Mr Luxon and a 52-person trade and media delegation on to Japan.
You haven't been over there, but I'm sure you've had, journalists from the press gallery have been over there. What have you heard?
It seemed pretty familiar, I guess, what happened this time around. Everything is looking fine. The press pack, the business delegation, the Prime Minister, his travelling staff and his foreign affairs officials hop on the plane. Everything starts out fine. And then they get to Port Moresby and it turns out that there is a fault. Obviously, massive frustrations there. The PM was able to hop on his plane and continue on, and he just left his business delegation and the press pack stranded there. Many people around the country would have been following along. They saw that the chief executive of Air New Zealand managed to reroute essentially one of his planes to come and pick them up. It helped that he was part of that travelling delegation. They managed to get back to Australia. The Air New Zealand plane picked them up from Australia and took them to Japan. So they did get there and they did get to engage or participate in most of the program that was planned for Japan. But they weren't there at the beginning, and it was also not a great look.
So there's a couple of 757s, right? You call one of them Betty?
There are two 757s, you are correct, and we have affectionately named them both Betty.
Right.
We'll say Betty 1 and Betty 2. They're identical twin sisters, I would say.
Yeah, and they used to be old commercial planes, is that right? And then the Defence Force bought it off commercial companies?
So these planes were bought by the New Zealand Defence Force in 2003. They're due to, or at the end of their life was due to be about 2028 to 2030. So, we're coming up to that deadline very fast. But you're right, they had about 10 years of life as commercial planes.
It's really like buying the old Toyota Corolla you see on the side of the road.
Yes, very fitting for New Zealand, isn't it? It fits absolutely with what we think of our Defence Force and what we can afford, But, they've done really well when you think, they already had 10 years and then we got them in 2003. It's just been in these recent years over the past few terms of government where we've seen things starting to get really tricky, where they're breaking down so much more regularly that it's getting to the point where it's starting to become quite embarrassing.
That is the word.
I mean, it has been an embarrassing week for the government and for New Zealand as well.
It's being called embarrassing. Of course it's embarrassing.
There's that embarrassment, but there's also the cost. While we don't want to spend money buying new planes, it seems there is a huge cost that goes into this maintenance and fixing these faults. So, and that's, we're kind of looking at tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars across the span of, a couple of years. I think it was about $70 million across a couple of years, and that's ballooning. It's becoming more and more expensive. Of course, there will always be maintenance costs with any aircraft. That's to be expected, but this is just becoming more and more expensive to keep it in the air. And to speak to your Toyota Corolla reference, it's kind of the same. We've all owned one of those, crappy old cars and we love them dearly, but at some point it costs more to keep them going than it almost does to just go and buy a new car. Of course, you have to have the capital to put up to buy the new car, don't you?
What are the chances of getting a new plane, Laura?
They're pretty high. I think the question is less are we going to get them and more when are we going to get them. So at the moment there is a defence capability review that is being undertaken. That started in about 2019 and that is looking at not just these planes but across our capability, things like planes and frigates and different types of vehicles, all of that type of stuff, where they stand, what needs to be upgraded, what would be the most fit for purpose, I guess, replacement, and also looking at, cost benefit, kind of weighing up those things there. As part of that, the 757s fall into it. Once that capability plan is delivered, then we'll be able to see a little bit more around what is being recommended. But our understanding is that there will be a recommendation to update these planes or to replace these planes.
Still, if Defence Minister Judith Collins' assessment is right, we could be waiting a while.
She has said we've looked at leasing arrangements, we've looked at purchasing new planes. It's hundreds of millions of dollars no matter what we do, and now is not the right time to do that. The pre-COVID estimate was somewhere between $350 million and $600 million. Obviously, that's a huge range. but it's going to be expensive to replace these planes. She is saying, yes, it's embarrassing when they break down. Yes, we're going to have to do it at some point, but she is not making that case for rushing it through.
So will you be bringing forward purchases that might have otherwise been delayed for a couple more years?
Well, we have to see. I mean, obviously this is big money.
As we talk about, we're in this cost of living crisis. Everyone's feeling it, and everyone's expecting the government to kind of tighten its belt. Everyone thinks about it as this being the PM's VIP plane. It's really hard for the government to justify spending money on replacing those at the moment in the current economic climate.
So that's what's going on with the planes. Now for the ferries that are supposed to connect the North and South Islands.
In breaking news, the inter-islander ferry Aratiri is believed to have run aground just out of Picton. The Herald newspaper is reporting emergency services are understood to be on standby.
Georgina Campbell is a Wellington-based journalist at the New Zealand Herald.
I feel like the Aratiri really illustrates why I have spent so much time reporting on the ferries, because it really was only a matter of time, in my view, that something like the grounding happened.
Yeah, so just briefly take me through what happened on Friday night.
So the Aratiri departed Picton at about 9:45 p.m. And then it suffered what has been described as a steering failure and ran aground. Thankfully, it ran into sand and mud rather than big rocks, and the hull remained watertight. There were 47 people on board. It was a freight-only sailing. Usually there are hundreds of people on board if it is a passenger sailing. No one was injured. They spent the night on the ship before being escorted off, and thankfully, the Aratiri was able to be refloated the following night, spent the night in the harbour, and it's now detained at Picton.
Yeah, we're very lucky that this wasn't any worse, but it's the latest in a string of issues, right?
Yes. We are all too familiar, aren't we, with examples of the Inter-Islander breaking down. And actually, there was an incident involving the same ferry, the Aratiri, in February last year. This time it was a passenger sailing, so there were 538 people on board, and it experienced a power blackout. This blackout only lasted a few seconds before the emergency generator kicked in, but it was without propulsion and drifting.
Okay.
Look, nobody was injured. Crisis was averted. But I wanted to look into this and requested Maritime New Zealand's report into this incident under the Official Information Act, and they gave me a summary of it. And they found that the power outage was caused by the failure of a part in the diesel generator called an actuator, and some tape, which is used to hold together wiring, had been used inside it, and over time, this tape had degraded to the extent that it caused debris to mix with the oil inside this part, and then that caused the part to seize. So, disintegrating tape. I mean, that's pretty bad, and KiwiRail has admitted that, that tape should not have been used in that particular environment. But look, the worst example, the scariest example that still gives me goosebumps is when Kaitaki lost power in Cook Strait.
The Kaitaki just visible off Wellington's south coast, where it lost all engine power.
It just stopped.
Gusts up to 100 kilometres an hour pushed the ship closer to the rocky coastline.
This time, 864 people on board, and it started drifting towards Wellington's rocky south coast. And look, that really was a case of the ferry narrowly avoiding a major maritime disaster.
So many issues, right? But there are 3 ferries, right, that Inter-Islander run across that strait. Now that the Aratiri's out, there's only one of them out of the 3 that can actually be used. Is that right?
Yes. So, unfortunately, this grounding has happened at a time where KiwiRail usually schedules maintenance for the ferries because it's winter and less people are using them, so it's a good time to do it. So the Kairahi has been laid up in Picton undergoing maintenance, and the Kaitaki is due to go to Singapore for dry dock in late July. This is all scheduled. The Aratiri has recently actually undergone maintenance, including an upgrade to its steering systems, and also gearbox issues were identified during its maintenance, which disrupted the schedule for the ferries again as it awaited parts from overseas. So it's not unusual for one of the ferries to be out for, a decent amount of time to undergo this maintenance. But now we've got the Aratiri out as well. So I think, we're still sort of waiting to see how long the Aratiri will be out of action for. It seems like there wasn't significant damage from the grounding, but it's hard to know sort of what state its steering system is in. It's worth noting that KiwiRail has recently really upped the ante on its maintenance.
Okay.
And this was in the wake of the Kaitaki incident that we just discussed. It has been well signalled that because they're investing more in maintenance, the ships could be taken out of service for longer. So KiwiRail actually conducted a full review of its asset management practices. They brought in global maritime experts to ensure that the Inter-Islander is operating to the world's best practice standards based on the age and condition of the existing fleet. And to be fair to KiwiRail, the performance, if you disregard the Aratiri grounding, the performance has been good in recent months, which KiwiRail says is the tangible results of this enhanced maintenance program. So the ferries had 99% reliability and 92% safe on-time performance to schedule during December to April. Also, a big improvement, because I wrote about this at the time, KiwiRail recently told Transport Minister Simeon Brown that Inter-Islander earlier this year had passed its annual Maritime New Zealand audit with excellent results, because just over a year ago, the audit found 9 non-conformities, some major. A year later, KiwiRail said it has recorded 0 non-conformities, and they say this is an exceptional outcome.
But had they deferred maintenance quite a bit before that?
I think that's a really interesting question. The biggest read that we have on that are these concerns that ministers have raised about KiwiRail's maintenance, and in their view, they're highly unimpressed with it. KiwiRail, I don't think, would ever admit to kind of deferring maintenance or anything like that. Whether it was the Labour government or this current government, they were relying on KiwiRail to maintain the existing fleet really well. Finance Minister Nicola Willis was recently asked exactly what is the end of life for the existing ferries, which I think is a question everybody wants to know.
Yep.
And she said the most recent advice KiwiRail has had from experts is that the ferries can keep operating safely and reliably until at least 2029. Which I was surprised by. And she said, look, the government would like to have new ships before then, but that is the expert advice on the kind of overall window. And so considering that, you have to think, well, what's happened with the maintenance that they have struggled so much, in the past 18 months, when the experts are saying actually they should be okay until 2029.
Where can we kind of point the finger at this? Is it worth pointing fingers? Do we blame KiwiRail for the poor asset management? I mean, the new government for taking away the new ferries?
The new government decided not to top up funding for KiwiRail's Inter-Islander upgrade and fleet replacement.
What's really happened here is we're saying the Ferrari is not the only car in the garage. Let's look and see if we can get some better value options. The Toyota Corolla option, the reliable option, or maybe a second-hand Tesla option.
I think KiwiRail has a lot of questions to answer. It needs to be held accountable for the maintenance of those ferries. That is an operational matter for KiwiRail to ensure that the ferries are safe and reliable and are maintained correctly. That's not really an issue for shareholding ministers. Shareholding ministers are responsible for the capital injection for new ferries. I think Nicola Willis had good reasons for cancelling a cost blowout of $1.5 billion, making the overall cost of the project almost $3 billion. That is concerning. There's plenty of correspondence under Grant Robertson's time as finance minister and Nicola Willis's time as the finance minister that shows just KiwiRail kind of constantly asking for more money and assuring ministers, it's only going to be a few $100,000 extra. Actually, it's more than $1 billion extra. And it's hard to have confidence in that, So I think Nicola Willis has understandable reasons, I think, for cancelling it. The thing that is the political risk for her now is that if a major incident happens with one of the ferries before the government has a plan in place. Now, we have had the Aratiri running aground, and that is a serious incident. But the mega ferries weren't due to arrive until 2026, so whether or not we had the new mega ferries, this would have still happened. I think the really risky part is after 2026. She has not committed to having new ferries in place by that time. And we've heard her say recently that there's been expert advice that, actually the current fleet can last until 2029. So if in that window there is a really serious incident, I think that's when it becomes particularly challenging for the government.
Well, what are some of the solutions here, Georgina? I mean, maybe the solution would have been the previous government saw the solution is getting these new ferries by 2026, and they already had the contract there. They were in the early stages of getting built, right? But this government seems to be a bit more keen on, say, the private sector. Well, that's David Seymour's call anyway.
You can keep changing the deck chairs, but unfortunately, you've got to ask the question, should private enterprise that's been successful be either contracted the service or just take it over completely?
Bluebridge, they run the ferry there. Have they had the same similar issues that the Inter-Islander have?
No, they have had mechanical problems, and unfortunately they had a few mechanical problems at the same time. The Inter-Islander fleet was having issues early last year, which created for the perfect storm, really, for passengers. But no, Bluebridge does not seem to be having as much difficulty as Kiwi Rail in this space. We actually know or have an insight into what the government is thinking around the future of Inter-Islander. There's a ministerial briefing that says the cancellation of Kiwi Rail's mega ferries leads to the possibility that the state-owned enterprise may not be best to provide an Inter-Islander service in the future. So officials are looking at how the market might respond to the hypothetical exit of Kiwi Rail, including whether Bluebridge could provide more capacity across Cook Strait. Officials have said in other documents that the Inter-Islander business could be separated into another state-owned enterprise or sold via a trade sale. I think transferring the Inter-Islander into another state-owned enterprise would be more palatable than some kind of asset sale. Kiwi Rail clearly has a lot on its plate. It's also dealing, with track issues in Auckland and Wellington. And I think the reason that people care about the ferries so much, or there's kind of huge public interest in them, is that many New Zealanders have travelled on one of these things at some point in their lives. Kiwis would probably want to keep those assets publicly held. Kiwi Rail has recently engaged global management consultants McKinsey & Company to undertake a strategic review intended to lift performance across its rail, freight and ferry business. And one of the things that Kiwi Rail's board wants Inter-Islander to take a bigger share of the Cook Strait market. So two quite conflicting points of view there.
We think of this ferry, we think of the plane, but also the pylon which cut power in Northland. Obviously, that was down to maintenance was happening, but it wasn't done in exactly the best way.
Transpower says contract workers removing too many nuts from the base plates caused a power pylon to collapse, sparking a major blackout in Northland.
What do you think about all these stories that we have about deferred maintenance or poor maintenance of key infrastructure in New Zealand?
Yeah, it's kind of becoming the narrative of this country, which is sad and concerning. And of course, those are just like big ticket items. You don't have to look very far in my own backyard in Wellington with all of the leaking pipes, crumbling pipes that we have.
And all over Wellington, pipes are bursting constantly. And what we can see is just a tiny part of it.
In Wellington at the moment, we're losing about 45% of the water that leaves the treatment plant and gets to my tap.
Over summer, we were at risk of running out of water, serious water shortage. It's frustrating, and it's going to take a lot of money to get us out of this, especially in the current economic climate. The government is looking at creative ways to get us out of it, because we don't have the money to kind of keep throwing at this, or, we don't want to be up to our eyeballs in debt. So, they're very keen on things like public-private partnerships. They've talked about, tolling new roads, like this mega tunnel that they're investigating under Wellington. We definitely need to get creative, because we can't afford to just not do anything.
That's it for today. The Detail is a newsroom production funded through RNZ and NZ On Air. This episode was produced by Gwen McClure and engineered by Ben Pearce. Thanks to Laura Walters and Georgina Campbell. I'm Tom Kitchen. Mā te wā.